Welcome to my series of video tutorials on how to prepare Form 990-EZ information return for small tax-exempt organizations. I'm David McCree. I'm a CPA, and you can find me on the web at myform990ez.com. This is how to prepare the header section of Form 990-EZ. Don't overlook this section because it's very important and it's probably the most neglected area of the return. First, this is a 2014 return, and the 2014 Form 990-EZ is used to report on any fiscal year that began in 2014, whether it begins on January 1st or whether it begins on July 1st or November 1st. If it begins in 2014, then you'll use the 2014 form, even if it covers part of 2015. On line A here of the header, this is where you indicate the accounting period that you're reporting on. You're going to leave it blank if you use the calendar year end. However, if it's a fiscal year end, you're going to enter the beginning date, and let's just use July 1st. It begins and it ends on June 30, and that's going to be 2015. Okay, so as you can see, it spans from July 1st, 2014 to June 30, 2015, and even though part of the year is in 2015, you're going to use the 2014 form. Now, you cannot report for a period that's longer than 12 months on one return. You can only report up to 12 months. And also, if you are reporting for a short period, shorter than 12 months, you're not going to be able to e-file that return unless you've either checked the initial return box or you've checked the final return box, because those are the those are the times when you're most likely to file a short year return. So now let's talk about the section B here in the header, and these are the checkboxes to notify the IRS of various circumstances. First one would be address change. Now you would check that if the organization has changed its address since the last time it filed a Form 990. Next box would be a name change. So if the organization has changed its legal name by changing its organizing documents with the state, then you're going to check name change, and then you're going to attach the documents that it filed with the state. If it's a corporation, it would have amended its articles of incorporation. If it's a trust, then it would have amended its trust document, and you would attach that. And if it's an unincorporated association, then it would have amended its constitution or other organizing document, and you would need to attach a copy of that, which would need to be signed by 2 members or officers if it's an unincorporated association. Now, if this is the first time that the organization has filed a Form 990, then you're going to check the initial return box. It doesn't matter how many years the organization has been in existence. If it has never before filed any of the Form 990 returns, then you would mark this box as the initial return. Now, if you filed a 990N, the electronic postcard notice, in a previous year, in a prior year, then you would not check the initial return box here, because it would not then be an initial return. If you mark the final or terminated box, that tells the IRS that this is the last exempt organization return that this organization is going to be filing. Now, if the organization is terminated by the board and the assets are distributed to another exempt organizations according to the articles of incorporation, a final return should be filed with a balance sheet that shows no assets and no liabilities. And you should refer to the instructions on what information to report on a final return. And remember that the due date of a final return is 4.5 months after the termination of the organization. Okay, so it's due sooner. If an organization's exempt status was revoked by the IRS and is not going to be reinstated, then you'll also file a final return. And in the future years, you would file whatever return is appropriate, either a 990-PF or a Form 1120 or whatever. If you've made revisions to a return that has already been filed, then you would check the amended return box. Also, don't forget to send a copy of the amended return to any state where the original return was submitted. Nonprofit organizations have 27 months from the date of creation to submit Form 1023, their application for tax-exempt status. And during that time, the organization is required to file any returns that come due. That would include a Form 990N, a Form 990EZ, or a Form 990, depending on what you're required to file. If the application, the Form 1023, has either not yet been filed, or if it's been filed but it hasn't been processed by the IRS, then you'll want to mark the application pending box to let the IRS know that your application is pending. Like I said, even if you haven't actually mailed the application to the IRS yet, but you intend to within the 27-month period. In the name section, you want to enter the organization's legal name. That would be the name that appears on the organizing documents of the organization. It should also match the name that is on the Form 1023 or Form 1024, whichever you're filing. And the address should match as well. The organization's name and the employer ID number has to match the address that the IRS has on file. If you enter the wrong name here, and the IRS will probably end up sending you correspondence, or if you're e-filing the return, they'll probably reject the e-file. And if you need to notify the IRS of an address change after you file the 990EZ, you can do it by using IRS Form 8822B. Also, if the organization does business under a different name other than its legal name, you can enter that here. That way both names will be there, so that anybody else who's reading the form who isn't familiar with your legal name, for instance, they just know you by your common name, then they'll recognize that it's your Form 990EZ. In Box D, Employer Identification Number, all organizations have to have an Employer ID number, even if it doesn't have employees. If you don't have one, you need to get one by filing IRS Form SS4. So enter the Employer Identification Number here. Going back to Box C for a second, I didn't talk about the address. You will want to use the mailing address where the organization is going to receive its mail. If it doesn't have an office, then you'll probably want to use one of the director's addresses here. And what I recommend is maybe using, rather than putting their home address here, maybe if they have a business address where they work, they could use that address. In Box E, telephone number, put the telephone number there where anyone who's calling about financial or tax matters would need to call. If the organization has an office, then you can use the office number there. If it does not have an office, which many small organizations do not have an office, you can use a director's phone number, but be sure that you have the director's permission before you use their phone number. In Box F, the group exemption number, if the organization is covered by a group exemption number, you would enter it here. This might be the case, for instance, with like a local chapter of a national organization, where the local chapter falls under the exempt status of the national organization instead of obtaining recognition of its own tax-exempt status. If you're not sure, check with any national or parent organization that you're affiliated with. Most organizations won't have a group exemption number. In line G, the accounting method, generally you're going to enter either cash or accrual. Most organizations that are small enough to file a Form 990EZ will will mark the cash box. Now, just because your QuickBooks balance sheet shows some accounts receivable and some accounts payable, that doesn't automatically mean that you use the accrual method. Maybe you're using a modified cash basis, but you would still mark the cash box. If you normally record things like prepaid expenses and uncollected pledges or deferred revenue, something like that, then you would mark the accrual box. You can only mark one box here. Now, if there's a state requirement that forces you to submit Form 990-EZ to the state using accrual accounting method, then you can usually use accrual for the federal Form 990-EZ, even if that's not normally the way that you keep your books. In box H, now this is probably one of the most important checkboxes in the entire return, and it's the one that most commonly results in correspondence from the IRS when it's not handled properly. If your organization is not required to attach Schedule B, then you must mark the box to indicate that you're not required to file a Schedule B. Okay? That lets the IRS know not to expect a Schedule B in this return. If you fail to check that box and you do not file a Schedule B, you will receive correspondence from the IRS, and almost guaranteed you will receive a penalty as well for filing an incomplete return. The Schedule B, beyond the scope of this particular video, I'll talk about it in another video, but it has to do with reporting significant contributions made to the organization. In other words, you're reporting large donors. So if you don't have any large donors, you're not required to attach Schedule B, then you would check that box to cover yourself. Website, you want to put the URL of your website in here. The purpose for this is not just because they're trying to collect information or whatever. The purpose of this is that your website contains a lot of information about your organization, and the IRS is interested in that. Okay? Your website represents your organization to the public, and to the IRS, and to grant-making organizations, and to various regulatory bodies and academic researchers. So what you put on your website provides clues as to whether your organization engages in certain activities like unrelated business, like perhaps advertising. You might have advertisements on your website. Whether you do any lobbying, whether you're engaged in political activities, whether you do certain types of fundraising, and what type of programs that you have, and whether you're making grants. If your website has a blog or a forum, somebody should be monitoring posts that the public might make on your blog to make sure they're not inappropriate. For instance, if your organization's social media person gets into a political discussion with a commenter, that could be an issue because you're not supposed to do anything that would influence a political campaign. So the IRS does look at websites, and it does match that against what's on Form 1023 and what's on your Form 990, if it has reason to do that. It doesn't mean that they sit around checking websites all day, but you want to cover yourself on that. Your tax exempt status, you can only check one of these, okay? And if you're a 501c3 public charity, you're just going to check that box right there and you're good to go. If you are, for instance, let's say you're a social club, all right, or some other organization, you're going to check this box and they give you an empty spot here to tell what you are. So if you're a social club, you're going to be a 501c7 organization. If you're a social welfare organization, you're going to be a 501c4, and you're going to put that in there. Okay. You would check the 4947A1 box if you're a non-exempt charitable trust. You would check the 527 box if you are a 527 political organization. On line K, the form of the organization, it's straightforward, but requires some explanation. Not everybody understands this. What they're asking for here is what type of a legal entity is your organization? Is it a corporation? Is it a trust? If you filed articles of incorporation with your state, you are a corporation and you would mark the corporation box. Okay? If you're a trust, you would have some sort of trust agreement, and you should know that, and then in that case you would mark trust. If you're not a trust and you never actually incorporated, then you are an unincorporated association and you would mark that box. Okay? With an unincorporated association, you would still have bylaws and some sort of a constitution, but they wouldn't be filed with the state. The other box really isn't going to apply for Form 990EZ. On line L, and really it's kind of more for the IRS purposes than it is yours. By the time you're filling out line L, really you should have already figured this one out, right? And in other words, before you even fill out all the header, you should know whether you're filing a Form 990E or EZ or not. So what they're telling you to do is determine what your gross receipts are. Okay, and for the purposes here, gross receipts are going to be all of your revenue items without reducing them for any expenses. So you can't reduce them by your gross receipts by cost of goods sold or by event expenses or by the basis of asset sales. All right, it's just, and they tell you here which lines to add up to determine your gross receipts. So if your gross receipts are $200,000 or more, you're going to need to file the full 990EZ. And you also need to check your total assets as well. If you have $500,000 or more in assets, which means cash, equipment, buildings, receivables, other assets, you name it. Add all those up. If it's more than 500, if it's 500,000 or more, you're going to need to file the full Form 990. So there you have it, a detailed explanation of the filling out the heading section of Form 990EZ. Probably more than you wanted to know, but it's stuff that you need to know, some of which is not found in the instructions. Good luck. Thanks for watching my video tutorial. If you need more help, you can find me on the web at myform990ez.com.